Hidden Horsepower Live, and I know this one's special. We got Mark Cronquist, who probably has a whole bunch of great stories about you, Lake. We'll put you on the spot a little bit later, but head engine builder for Joe Gibbs Racing for many years, 3 Cup championships, over 125 wins on the track in nationwide competition, a whole host. If there was an engine builder Hall of Fame, and maybe there is,
there should be one.
We could perhaps start it right here, right now. Mark, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate that. There's a few that probably need to be in there before me, but I appreciate that. That's nice.
No, well, it's great. And for me, as a fan, a TV fan of NASCAR, right? Like growing up and being a drag racer and watching the explosion of NASCAR and popularity and being able to sit home and watch all of these things and knowing these like seminal moments, things that happen, that you were there, this guy's there. It's already worn off for me with Lake, but that you were there and behind a lot of these big moments in NASCAR. I'm excited about this.
Appreciate it.
Well, last night we were having dinner, and so Keith Dorton's going to be on here later, and of course Billy Godboll's going to be on here later, and Ben Strader. We were sitting down at the other end of the table and we were talking, and Mark just leans over to Keith and says, "So what about that manifold 1991?"
right out of the box.
Right out of the box.
There's no fluff.
I never got the time to ask him, so I finally got it. Hey, sit right there. Let me ask you about that.
We're going to ask Keith that question later. That way we can let him get the answer on it. But we went into that discussion about the plate era and all the things that came out of that. So, shed a little bit of your story, and what do you think about what that plate era did in terms of engine development?
I think the biggest thing the plate era did back in the late 80s and 90s was teach us about friction, oils, friction, coatings, because you got a motor choked down. There's only a few places to go from there, and a lot of it's friction. So I think that taught us a lot of how big oil pump you need to have, what kind of coatings do help and don't help, what kind of oils do help and don't help, and all that stuff. I think if you can go back and say what was good about it, it taught us a lot about that part of what's bad about it is, wow, we spent a lot of money.
Wow. And there were some really, we'll call it, we'll call it cheating, right? Well, there were some interesting ways of cheating or rules aversion.
Well, I mean, it's people... I in my whole career, like what Keith did with the manifolds back in the 80s and the early 90s, to me there was no rules, and if you make a rule, you're my hero.
Exactly.
The way I look at it, the guy that died when we're all dead and we're all gone, the guy with the most rules against him is the winner.
He's the winner, exactly. Yeah.
And Keith Keith and his group, they did a phenomenal job doing the manifold. There was no rules. NASCAR let it go for a little while. Then they started getting rules, and so Keith, that's all Keith's fault there on that one. But
so what about those holes in the valve seats?
I don't know nothing about those. There's a few guys that did that one. I don't know nothing about that one.
I just want to say that we're talking about things that happened last century.
Yes.
So the statute of limitations, it's definitely expired. We can put it all out there on the table.
Yeah. There were some guys that were running, NASCAR had a rule that you had to close all the intake valves and they pressurized the manifold to make sure you had no leaks. Well, they were smart enough to drill their holes in the valve seats, so when the valves were shut, it blocked the holes off, and when the valves opened, there was holes there. So
let it get more air in the combustion chamber because you couldn't get it past the plate.
Right. So they went around the plate, got more air, makes more power. So.
Yep.
But I don't know if I think there was rules against that one.
Probably was.
I think technically there was rules against that one.
But if you didn't get caught, then you technically weren't cheating. I think Richard Petty said something like that.
Yep, you're right there. Everybody, you're not cheating until you get caught. So that's a good way of putting that. So
So transition that a little bit. So you went from this restricted class of racing where you had compression rules and all these rules, and like you said, the way to win was to get the most rules in your name.
Yep.
Now you're doing this desert off-road stuff. What kind of mindset shift was that?
That was huge. In 2018, we started building a Baja 1000 type motor, and it was hard to sit down there for working so many years in NASCAR with this big old rule book. There's hardly no rules. So it was like, I remember the biggest thing was we were trying to decide on what kind of spark plug we were going to run. And we're sitting there looking at a 14 millimeter plug, looking at 14 millimeter plug, trying to figure out how we're going to put it between these two valve seats. And we go, why are we messing with a 14 millimeter plug? And my engineer said, there's a rule. I go, there is no rules. He goes, you're right. You're right, there's not. We end up with a 10 millimeter plug, a little tiny thing right in between the seats. So it was crazy when you work your whole life with this big rule book, and there wasn't when I started that big, but by the time, now it's a huge book. It could almost be a novel, but there's so many rules that, it's hard to unfamiliarize yourself to that, and it was pretty hard for a while.
Well, the comment you asked Billy last night, can you possibly close the intake valve too soon?
Yes. Yeah.
And it's like, because you said, okay, in compression limited engines, this is a way to gain compression.
That's how you get compression back. You shut the intake sooner, you make more compression. And it was just conversation. It was like, and my whole life, I've, ever since 2004, 2005, we've been compression limited. Mm-hmm. So it's like, how do you cheat that? You shut the intake valve sooner. Yeah, so now, and that's in our conversations last night having dinner, it was like, I said, I didn't know you could shut the thing too soon. Yeah. I always, our whole goal is to shut as fast as we can. I didn't know, looking at, that's what's great about talking with other people is you learn what other people do and stuff. And some engines wanted to shut later, mm-hmm. but fortunately, my whole life, I've always worked with a great cylinder head and a great block and a great this, and I've never had to fight that issue. So,
right.
Yeah.
So speaking about blocks and heads.
I'm actually spoiled, so.
Right. Oh, yeah. Well, so back to blocks and heads. So the Desert Off-Road Truck engine, that's the JD1 in honor of JD Gibbs, who's our hero. I mean, he was a
great boss.
Awesome man. He was great for all of us, right?
Yes, absolutely.
But with the JD1 engine, talk about that development process of getting your own heads and blocks. Because that engine doesn't exist outside of your shop.
No, it's something it's billet block, billet heads, all designed by us at JGR, some people at CFE that does the head porting and the block machining to rough with. But I was explaining to a couple guys, it's got a little bit of small block in it, it's got a little bit of big block in it, it's got a little bit, it's a hodgepodge of everything that we thought was the best of everybody and some ideas of ours. So it's got a little bit of everybody. You can look at it and say, oh, that's LS, and you can look at it and say, okay, that's NASCAR, or, current stuff. So it's a copy of a lot of people's stuff.
Right, but that's not the first time you've actually been in process of developing an engine, because you were part of the development team with the RO7.
Yes, we actually, RO7 started out at R99 because it was supposed to race, it did race in, I think the first race was the ARCA race at Charlotte in 1998 or 99, one of them two. Okay. But that's where R99 came from. It was supposed to race in 1999. And so you can look at how much we developed up the RO7 because 2007 there was a
8 year.
Yeah, there was an X at one time because we hated to keep calling it numbers, but it was really a 5. There was an RO3 and there was, I think, an RO1, but I don't think it ever got built.
So for those watching, what's essentially the difference on a high level perspective from a small block Chevy to an RO7? What was the big change or the main changes?
It was more set up for the NASCAR header combination in the cars, manifold. It was the small block and the big block Chevrolet have two faults I think, and that is the head bolts are right next to the cylinder walls.
Okay.
And that's a lot of bore distortion. So that the bolts got spread out more like a Ford block is, how they're spread away. You actually have the stud, you have water, then you have the cylinder wall.
Okay.
The small block and the big block Chevrolets are right up against each other. You torque them down, they twist. You get them hot, they twist differently. So that was probably the biggest difference. The camshaft is raised, bigger cam core, but there was a lot of good things and a lot of technology.
What was the size of the cam on that? Was that?
Those are the RO7 is a 60 millimeter cam core, but a stock small block is 50. So 10 millimeter bigger cam cores.
And it's raised up.
Yes, it's raised up to get for the crankshaft and get a cam tunnel in it where there's no, the oil on top of the motor don't end up in the bottom of the motor. So it has to be a wet or a dry sump system. Dry sump system. You can't wet sump it unless you cut a bunch of stuff out. But
and also the valve layout is symmetrical. It's not Siamese, correct?
Right. Yes, and a lot of the valve layout now is a NASCAR rule. You have to be in this box of this location,
Mm-hmm.
But
We
you
found out
can
why.
do can do this, or you can do this and this. You know, I mean, you
Right.
can do other things. The valve layout, like intake, exhaust, intake, exhaust, intake, or whatever. But NASCAR rules are pretty close to. You have to be in this box of this area and end up there. So.
Right. So essentially, for people watching, the R07 valve layout is similar to a big block Chevy because it's not.
Yes.
It's symmetrical. It's not Siamese.
Yes, and it's not in a straight line. The intake's above the exhaust. The exhaust is below center line.
They're splayed and canted correctly.
Yes. The intake is, but the exhaust is just
not.
The exhaust is not.
Okay.
But that's a NASCAR rule.
Right.
Toyota, when they first came in with their PH9 Phase 9 engine that was in trucks only, it had a canted exhaust too.
But that was
NASCAR
it was too good.
NASCAR took that away from everybody. So
Yeah.
Yep.
So probably a lot of lessons learned from the development of the R07 were applied to the JD1?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, a lot, and really the RL7 there was a lot applied from R99. Or the Chevrolet guys, we were still a Chevrolet team at that time. We were probably glad RL3 never got approved. We were really trying to get it approved. RL9 was RL7 was a lot better block and head combination package.
And R07 was compacted graphite block as well.
Yeah.
And so I know Ed Keebler and a lot of the Keith and the segments we've done, but previously talked about how difficult it is to hone compacted graphite compared to the gray cast iron.
Yes, way different. So we actually, the good thing is we actually made small blocks, or the 18 degree or the SP2 block. We actually made those blocks first and learned how to do that before RL7 came about. So we kind of had that figured out before we started building that motor. So
you talk about the bore distortion. Talk a little bit about your experience with hot honing.
Hot honing, I mean, we really learned a lot about hot honing on the 18 degree or the SP2 head because the head bolts were right up against the cylinder wall. And that to me it was a big issue. When the thing got hot, it really distorted them. Now we don't see that with, speaking to ourselves, we don't see that with the Toyota NASCAR engine or at the time the RL7. We didn't have to do that because the bolts were moved away and they're not distorting. There is still some head clamp differences there, but we didn't see it as bad.
All right.
With that.
So the head bolt location.
Bolt location was the biggest issue there with hot honing. So yeah.
The information download here at the Engine Performance Expo, absolute insanity. If you've got a question for Mark, by all means, put it in our chat section. Mark, we've had some people check in from Alaska. That is your home state. How do you make it from Alaska to Charlotte, North Carolina? Tell us a little bit about your origin story.
I was born and raised in Eagle River, Alaska, to about 14, and then unfortunately my parents separated when I was younger, and I actually left Alaska and went to Colorado Springs, and that's actually where my stepdad at that time actually got me started in working in a machine shop in the back of a auto parts store that he worked at, or actually he didn't work there, he worked at the competitor's auto parts store, and that's where I started my career when I was 16, was starting to work on engines.
Did you always have an interest for things mechanical, engines? Were you the kid that was tearing apart stuff in the yard?
Yeah, I realized really quickly my dad was owned probably the largest body shop in Alaska at the time, and I realized very quickly I wasn't going to be a body man.
There's a lot of reasons not to be a body man. Let me just tell you.
And,
Love you, body guys.
I can remember my dad when I was like 12 years old. He raced professionally for Skidoo or Bombardier and he had like 6 or 7 old sleds out back. He said, if you put one of them together, you can have it. So when I was 12, the whole summer I put a whole snowmobile together by myself. So had a little help, but basically put a snowmobile together by myself out of a bunch of used parts. So
that was the original incentive.
That was the original incentive. My dad had a kid, or I call him a kid now, but he was older than I was. His name was Fred Grondike, that worked at my dad's body shop, and he had an old 56 Chevrolet pickup truck. And the 5 or 6 years I remember him working there, I think we rebuilt that engine like 5 or 6 times. He had a hard time starting it up in the morning and forgetting it needed to idle for a little bit. Alaska when it's kind of cold, I can remember him driving in and just wah, wah, wah. And next week we were changing this. So a lot of it was Fred's, that 56 Chevrolet pickup truck. I realized I didn't want to be a body man, and hey, I kind of like motors, so that's kind of where it all turned right then. So
The rest is history. Your
The rest is
career
history.
path found you.
If I remember right, there's some story about, was it high school shop class, some kind of reverse rotation engine or something?
No. I was actually working in machine shop at high school, and I think I kind of thought I knew more than the teacher knew, which I think I did. But he had me put a small block Chevrolet together, and I had already done that a million times. So I happened to be left 2 pistons and rods out. And I put a counterweight on it, and I blocked off some holes, and it actually fired up. But it was sitting there shaking, and he goes, "What's wrong with this thing?" I go, "I don't know. I think I had these 2 extra parts." And at that time, the principal decided I needed to be in wood shop instead of automotive class. So I thought it was a genius. I thought I plugged the lifters, I plugged the crankshaft.
And it was all for a goof on your teacher?
It was kind of a goof on the teacher. Yeah.
See,
I thought he'd be proud of that.
They should have been.
I put a lot of small block Chevrolets together already. That was like,
You go all that way for it. Yep.
Yeah, so.
What do these do?
Yeah, that's what I did. So, yeah, the principal decided I needed to be in wood shop instead of automotive class.
But at least you had an automotive class,
Yes,
which is something
yes.
that we think about nowadays, right? We want more.
Yes. Please bring those back to schools.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very
Learn how to change your oil and change your tire. Even the wood shop, I know a lot of kids got hurt because cut their fingers off and stuff. But at least get people to know how to run that stuff, man. It's sad that kids today don't work on cars like we used to.
Well, but some do.
Yeah, some do. Yes.
Well, that's the thing. There's a lot of guys that are watching this right now.
Yes, absolutely.
That are part of that.
Sounds like
question?
the teacher and the principal need a better sense of humor.
Yeah.
Right?
No doubt.
I thought it was genius myself.
Here's one. Mark, where are gains, as small as they are, found in today's NASCAR engines? Focus still on friction reduction in the tapered spacer era?
Yes.
Asks Bob. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, Bob, it's still friction. Close the intake valve as soon as you can to make as much compression. We've ran a restricted motor, even what NASCAR calls, they don't like to call them restricted motors, but the tapered spacers are all a restrictor plate motor. It still comes down to how light a valve spring can you put on it and get rid of friction. Friction with the roller camshafts now, the valve spring is not as important as it used to be for friction. But when we ran flat tops, it was like we had valve springs down to 90 pounds on the seat. It was all about getting rid of friction in the camshaft.
What about
the Spintron was running
all the time.
What about that whole concept? We're watching NASCAR evolve over the years, and it's high-level entertainment, and it's on television, and they've got a new car coming and everything. But I remember not long ago, like 950 horsepower, and you guys the driver talent was getting the power to the ground. Can they control it? This is a totally different era, a totally different style of racing. That's got to change what you're doing. But do you guys love it the way they did back in the wide open Wild West era?
Answering for myself, no. I don't love it like I used to. Back, I can think of 2000, 2008, there wasn't that many rules. And it was, I remember 1999, 2000, we were running Pontiacs at the time, and we had a hood height issue. And we sat down one year and we're like, okay, we cut a 1/4 inch off the blocks, and we cut a bunch off the heads, and we shrunk it all down. And eventually, basically what we did is we shortened the intake runners, and we picked up all this power and said, we're geniuses. Basically we're trying to lower the intake, so we lowered everything else, and then when we're all sitting down, we're making all this power, and we go, that was pretty good thing right there, So those rules are not allowed to do today. There's a deck height rule, and there's this rule, and hey, by the way, I get the deck height rule, and that when I die, that was because of us. So yeah, the deck height rule is because of us, and just things like that NASCAR has kept, got their fingers on. And
that was a championship year for you.
Yes, that was 2000. So
Bobby Labonte.
Yep.
Well, speaking of 2000, there's a guest coming on later.
I know it.
Mike Mucha from Lubrizol, which we won't steal the thunder of that right now, right?
Yep.
But talk about that era, right, of 2000, 2008. Yeah. That was like this great time where.
You could almost say in the 90s to the 2007, 8 era, somewhere in there. I think was just it was wide open. There was a lot of money in NASCAR. We did a lot of things.
Right.
I mean, not they're still not, and they do a lot of things now, but I always tell the NASCAR guys this. I said, we used to move the intake port over a quarter of an inch and picked up 30 horsepower. I said, now we work for 2 years and spend millions of dollars and we can't pick up 5. You know, I mean, because the tighter you make the rules, the more you have to go search for the special coatings and the special this and that and everything else. So sometimes rules cost, all rules cost money. So,
that has been a common thread through Hidden Horsepower, the podcast, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify. You should definitely listen. Mark has been on in the past. This is almost a second edition. But that is a common thread throughout all the engine builders. Like, it seems that a series or a sanction might think like, oh, we're going to save guys money by creating these rules, and inevitably they end up spending and costing money because people aren't going to just stop trying to be first. They're going to go in 10 different directions and go to other countries and other planets for metal, materials, machinery to circumvent that new rule. And it looks like you lived that experience.
Yeah, it was actually a great time in NASCAR, you know, from magnesium intake manifolds to, you know, a lot of stuff that was cool, you know, trying to take out weight. Now there's a rule against that, you know.
You went from un-DLC coated parts to
DLC,
wrist pin.
DLC coated wrist pins, and a lot of other parts are DLC coated now. So
that was a whole story by itself. Just the development of DLC for the lifters and the cams and
now pistons and everything else. I mean, it's more and more, you know. And I always tell the story. Before Robert Yates passed away, I had the privilege of going out to lunch with him one day, and we were talking about the things we know today that we didn't know back then. And I remember a couple years ago talking to him, and I go, man, I don't know how we won a championship in 2000, 2002. And he goes, I know. He said, you were just smarter than the rest of us dummies that day. You know, he goes, what we know today to what we know back then with surface finishes and stuff like that, it's phenomenal what we've learned, but knowing how we did it and how much work we had to go around back then to get things to last was just crazy. So.
Well, and that's one of the things we talked about before some of the trackside tech talks this year with the NHRA events, is that you think back to, say, 2000 when you had qualifying engines and all of these things, and that one race motor would run the one race, it'd be down how much horsepower in a race, and you had to rebuild it for the next race. And now you have engines that go for how long before you rebuild them?
The Cup races, they run them twice, and Xfinity, we almost run them 4 times.
And they're still barely dropping off.
Barely dropping off. So that comes back to better oils, better coatings, better rings, better honing, better valve jobs, better everything, you know. And
friction and surface finish.
Yes. You go back here and you look back in the shop and you look at the Rottler stuff and stuff, just machining stuff better, honing stuff better. It's all that stuff to do with that. So.
Tribology for the win, Joe. Always tribology for the win.
And so not all rules are bad, because making you guys figure out how to do that has pushed everything forward.
Oh, yes, absolutely, yes. By far, we realized what we needed, and we went to the companies and told them we need this, and they stepped up and they made that stuff for us.
There's got to be a reason. Billy Godbold has said, like, Cafe Standards has forced OEs to figure stuff out, and that technology has advanced. We'll be speaking with him about it. I'd like to know if you have something ready and available, a concept, an idea, a road that you went down to try to circumvent the system, to find horsepower, to do something that was just out of the box and maybe didn't work, and now you look back on it and you think, man, what were we thinking?
Ooh.
Because, we learn so much from the failures.
Yeah,
we learn everything from failures.
We talk about the great successes all the time, but the failures, I think, are where some of the fun is.
The no taper on the cam lobe with DLC, that was tricky.
Yeah. Boy, that's a good one. There were so many. so many. I had a cylinder head guy one time. His name was Rex Hackcock, and he told me one day, he goes, you're not as smart as people think you are. He goes, but you are very smart for one thing. I go, what's that? He goes, when we go one way and it doesn't work, he goes, you're smart enough to go the other way to see if it was better. So he goes, we do a lot of stuff that don't work, but he said, you're smart enough to go back the other way and try to see if it works. But I just can't think of one that pops out top of my head right now.
Which, by the way, you're saying that, though.
There's a good one with Mike Mucha that we actually ran oil with water in it. That was pretty impressive, that test. So
we should save that for later, right? We'll save that for later.
We'll save that one for later. But there was, I don't know. There was...
Well, they're going the opposite direction.
Yeah.
That's Chad Canals too.
Yeah.
Chad was big on that, on the chassis stuff,
Right.
or
Yes.
aero stuff. If we go one way and it didn't work, well, let's try the opposite.
Just make sure you're in the right spot.
And there's a lot of times it really paid off.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's that being, but back to what Warren Johnson said, you can't be afraid to fail.
Yeah.
So you got to be willing to try some stuff and go for it. You know, I think about, you know, the oil development stuff. We figured up that 1 year, a plate motor back in the day was roughly cost average, $85,000, something like that. And we did 7 or 8 engine tests 1 year doing some oil development.
Yeah.
We were like, wait, we just spent $1 million in engines testing oil.
Yeah. I remember when Mr. Gibbs let me buy the first AVL dyno in NASCAR, and he's like, is this gonna be good for us? I go, oh, it's gonna be great. I didn't tell him how much money we were going to spend on motors running across that thing. No. Holy cow, so you can go through some money running motors.
So explain to people, if they don't know, what is an AVL dyno? What makes it different from the dynos that most people know?
AVL dynos are AC powered dynos, so you can actually stick the thing on there and run durability laps. You can run simulation laps. You can run. So at the time in the late 1990s, we ran to Kentucky Motor Speedway with a car and a driver and 8 sets of tires, and we'd run 500 miles. We'd come home, tear it apart. Well, that, tire blows and wrecks your test, the motor, So AVL dyno, we just go bolt the thing on there, pull the hammer back, set the computer, and it sits there and runs 500 miles. And that afternoon, we take it apart.
Complete
and
racing.
We didn't ask the driver to go. We didn't ask tires. We didn't ask nothing. And it's not 100%. It's actually, to me, it's worse on the dyno than it is the racetrack, because the way we set it up is we go there and we take the fastest lap at Kentucky, and we ran 500 laps at that. Well, as tires fall off, it gets slower. So we actually feel like if we could make 500 miles, we are guaranteed to go to the racetrack with that.
Did you simulate pit stops in that thing or no?
We had some stops. We did learn that, leaving downshifting was important. So we had to put some of them in there. We just did those at the end of the test, not at the beginning of the test and stuff.
Right.
We just did that stuff at the end, just as we didn't do 100 miles in a pit stop. We just did 500 miles and did some stuff after that.
And the reason you can do that with an AC unit dyno is because you don't have all that water that a water brake dyno has to have, because otherwise you would have to have like an ocean of water not to get it too hot.
Yeah, well, we have Lake Norman close to us. But
That's true.
I don't think they'd let us tie into it, but no, AC dyno is a computerized controlled dyno, so it works. There is one good story about that one though. So in our industrial park, when we moved into our industrial park, there was no hospital there. Well, they built the hospital. So this is funny. Well, it's not really funny, but
I already know the story. Keep on going,
I don't know the story, but
so in the building, there was at the back side of the building where we're at, you have a power source coming in, and the other side of the industrial park, there's 2 power sources. So hospital is on A, we're on B.
Right.
Something happened to A one day, and they had to switch to B, which it was back up to keep the hospital running. Well, unfortunately, we were running our AC dyno at Richmond that day, and we were so the AC dyno, when we're running durability, actually sends power back into the power. Well, it's not very clean, so all the hospital monitors were going. You could tell when it lifted off the gas and quit making power. Then as it went up on RPM, they were free. And luckily there was a race fan there that knew something about why every monitor was doing this, and there's hey, something's doing this. This isn't true. And they knew we had a dyno or something. Somebody at the hospital knew. They come running down there and had to shut it off till they got their power to A source back running. So that was actually pretty hilarious.
Yeah, very funny.
It was all the heart monitors are going up and down, and everybody in the whole hospital was doing it. So,
right.
Yeah,
so we're going to be doing a testing roundtable and a measuring roundtable later, and you're going to join us for both. You didn't know that, but you are. So talk about how precision, that's one of the other advantages of the AC dyno, how accurate it is in terms of precision.
It's really precise, but it shows you that you need to even do more, because there's no water temperature, there's no water. The temperature of an AC dyno or a water brake dyno, the water temperature changes it, everything changes, everything can affect it. The AC is guaranteed to be the same. But now it shows that your air intake temperature is not exactly right. It shows you that your oil temperatures might not be you know what I mean?
Right.
Before it was always, oh, that's the dyno, that's the dyno. Now you realize that the room temperature when it's cold outside isn't the same as when it's 90 degrees outside. So it's a lot better, but it still ain't perfect. It's still a lot.
And what happens about like mid-March in North Carolina when there's yellow on the cars?
We always lose power. If somebody can tell me how to get rid of pollen in the air, I'd be a happy person.
Isn't that the craziest thing?
Yes.
Like literally, it's like you could like dial it up. Oh, there's pollen on the cars in the parking lot. You're gonna lose power.
You want to know another one that we determined?
What's that?
That when they changed the VAR saw in the shop, that we lose power for about a week.
Just because of all the light ins, all the vapor.
All the vapor and the lights, the air going in the motors is not as good. It's crazy. It was like, what did we do? And it was like, now that's the AC dyno taught us that we're like, what is this? And we're like, we don't know. Pollution does it to us too. You know, when the air is polluted more outside, that's why we think in summertime we lose more power.
Okay.
Because of the pollution in the air and stuff.
Excellent. Well, Mark, this has been great. We had a quick question from Bryce. I want to get it in for Bryce out there. Bryce asks about restrictor plates and that style of racing. Like, how does that affect air-fuel ratio? Like, if you're, at Daytona, say, where I'm sure intake vacuum is going to be up at a high RPM, do you lean out the air-fuel ratio so that excess fuel doesn't displace your limited airflow? Kind of like what we were talking about, getting it to the cylinder.
Actually, this is kind of opposite that way. The biggest issue we have with tuning restrictor plate cars at Daytona is when you're the car behind the other car. They talk about the bubble.
Yes.
You always hear about the bubble. A lot of that is the air coming off the other car and crashing right at the cowl on the other car, and it actually throws so much air in there that we actually get lean. Our carburetor air temperature or our carburetor pressure actually goes up at that time, and actually would get lean, and that's a lot of reason why you can't get through that bubble. Besides the air coming off and hitting the windshield, acting like a big spoiler. Another part of it is when that air enters the cowl in that area right there, it actually pressurizes it and actually leans the motor out. And that's why a lot of times for those races we actually have to run fatter. So when you get in that spot, you have that extra fuel to help get you through that spot.
There you go. Good question, Bryce. Thank you very much. All right, gentlemen. Mark, this has been great. This is your second time on Hidden Horsepower. We encourage everybody to download the previous episodes. There's a lot of great ones up there on wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, the TotalSeal.com website. This has been great. And I know you guys have got a great relationship. You're a big personality. I love it. And more to come, right? What a great career you've had, but still forging forward. And I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
Lake, this has been pretty impressive.
This is what I wanted to get him, right? I had to twist a lot of arms to get some folks here.
Is that true?
Nah, not really. I'll do anything for Lake.
So we got a great cast of people here today, and looking forward to these kind of information. Then measuring later on, testing roundtable. It's going to be some pretty good stuff.
Exactly.
You did tell me Jason Lyon was going to be here.
Yeah.
He's not here.
No, he told me too.
It's like we'll talk about that one later.
Yeah, it's all right. I'm sure Jason's out there at the track wherever they're testing, watching the Engine Performance Expo.
Okay.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe not. All right, coming up next, we're going to talk about an aspect of engine building, Lake, something pretty important.
Reverse blueprinting, right? We all know about blueprinting an engine to make sure that you know what you had going together. But if you kind of reverse that process and you take that used engine apart, you can learn a lot. I mean, as you've told me that before, that, hey, if you're building an engine and rebuilding that engine every week like you did in the old days, you learned a lot quickly because you could see what the engine was telling you.